the white of sky. Crack! Miles was startled awake. His hammock swung as he quickly sat up. His ears twitched as the sound of rain hitting the skylight reached them. He glanced up and took a deep breath. A storm must have started after he and Sonic had fallen asleep. Miles looked over to see if Sonic was awake. Unfortunately, no. Another flash of lightning etched across the piece of sky that Miles could see, and within seconds the loud drumming of thunder followed it. Miles flinched and lay back down to try to go back to bed. It was outside and they were inside after all. He pulled the blanket over his head, hoping to block out the sound. However, as the storm went on, the thunder just seemed to grow louder and louder. Miles stuck his head out from the covers, and just as he did, lightning crashed outside, lighting up the entire room in a white light. The thunder that it showed, it sounding like it was right on top of him. Miles let out a gasp and tumbled out of his hammock. The only reason he didn't completely crash onto the floor was that he had caught himself with his tails. He gently set himself on the floor, the blanket that he dragged down with him wrapped up in his arms. Miles looked up at Sonic. Sonic, however, was still fast asleep from what Miles could tell. Miles let out a deep breath. Well, if he wasn't going to fall asleep up here in the attic, he could try falling asleep downstairs on the couch. He dropped the ladder, trying hard not to wake Sonic, and carefully climbed down. He quietly snuck down the stairs, the blanket dragging behind him. Miles entered the living room and dropped onto the couch, pulling the blanket up over him. He flinched again as thunder rumbled outside, but it wasn't as bad as it had been up in the attic. Miles rolled over so he was facing the back of the couch and burrowed into the blanket. Sonic woke up to the sound of the ladder dropping. His ears twitched and he rolled over to see the tips of Miles' ears duck down the stairs. Sonic tilted his head up to look at the alarm clock next to his bed. 3:23 in the morning. Sonic let out a sigh and tried to figure out what his little brother could be up to. That's when the sound of rain caught his attention. A flash of white and then a rumble of thunder a few seconds later clued Sonic in on what Miles was up to. Sonic remembered when he first met Miles and how the kid flinched every time there was thunder.
Okay, big brother time.
Sonic muttered as he pushed himself up. He stretched and grabbed a couple of his blankets, his pillow, and his phone with his headphones. He quickly folded the blankets and grabbed them and the pillow before dropping them through the hole in the floor and onto the ground of the floor below. He then rushed over and grabbed his phone and climbed down the ladder. He picked up the blankets and pillow and started searching the house. It wasn't long before he found Miles laying on the couch. Sonic watched as lightning flashed, causing Miles to flinch slightly. Then as the thunder rolled, Miles curled in tighter and reached for his ears, letting out a small whine. Sonic was by the couch in seconds. He flicked out and draped another blanket on top of Miles, causing the fox to uncurl and look up at him.
Sonic!
Miles asked. He grabbed the blanket Sonic had placed on him.
What are you doing up? I didn't wake you, did I?
Sonic shook his head.
Now the storm did. It sounds pretty nasty out there.
Sonic said. He laid on the couch with Miles and dragged the other blanket on top of himself.
I have my phone if you want to drown out the thunder.
Miles looked up and untangled his arm out from under the blanket. He reached over for the phone.
Yes, please.
He muttered. Sonic smiled and passed over his phone and headphones. He watched as Miles quickly pulled on the headphones and tapped on the music app on the phone.
You have anything calming on here?
Miles asked. Sonic snorted and sat back up. He leaned forward so he could look at what Miles was looking at.
What? Don't find hunted relaxing?
Sonic asked with a smirk. Miles rolled his eyes.
No, not really.
He said. Sonic stuck his tongue out and tapped on the screen of the phone.
I've got the perfect soundtrack. I use it to help me sleep sometimes.
He said.
Nights?
Miles asked. Sonic hummed.
It's a video game Tom showed me. It's really fun and the music is really nice.
Sonic tapped on the replay album button and then on the first song.
That should help drown out the thunder.
He said. Just as he said that, a roll of thunder echoed outside. Miles flinched and turned the music up a little. He slowly relaxed and smiled up at Sonic. Sonic held up a thumb and smiled when Miles nodded his head. Miles pulled the blanket up and quickly made a motion with his fingers that Sonic didn't recognize. Miles then scrunched up his brow and looked up.
Night?
He mumbled. Sonic nodded his head.
Right?
He said back, though he doubted Miles could hear him. Miles nodded and then laid back down. Sonic laid back down too. He watched as Miles slowly dozed off and fell back asleep. Soon, Sonic too fell asleep. Outside, the storm continued to blow and crash. Maddie stepped out of her and Tom's bedroom to spot the ladder leading up to Sonic and Miles' room down. It wasn't a completely unusual sight. Sonic sometimes forgot to close it, but it had become less of an occurrence since Miles had moved in and it wasn't usually down this early in the morning. She carefully climbed up, but one look in the room told her that neither were in the room. She climbed back down and lifted the ladder and closed the attic door. Maddie quietly went down the stairs and searched the house. It wasn't long before she found both Sonic and Miles fast asleep on the couch. Miles' red blanket was draped across him almost cape-like and he had a blue blanket tucked under his head. Sonic had a dark blue blanket covering him and had a matching pillow tucked under his head. She smiled fondly and headed to the kitchen to start breakfast.